last year, and he gave a talk there, and I thought it'd be really interesting for him to give it to Boulder Ruby. But he's a very experienced CIO, and in 2019, he was Innovator of the Year in Chicago. He's worked all across different industries, but this particular talk is about ethics and programming. And what really attracted me about this talk was it's something that you can drop into your regular process. So with that, I'd love to hand things over to Kevin. So thank you.
Thanks, Dan. So just a little bit of history on the ethics. I started thinking about this maybe 2-3 years ago, at least, with some of the scandals. The big one was I was sitting around having cocktails and we were talking about the Volkswagen smog scandal. And a lot of it was generated through the software guys, right? They had not, they'd done some unit tests and they had hard-coded stuff and they had left it in and then they didn't tell anybody, right? And that's part of the story. And I kept thinking, how does that happen? How could you not speak up, right? And I had a conversation with my father, who was a practicing physician, but he's also a bioethicist. And I said, well, how would you handle this in medicine? And he went through this long discussion about ethics. And my dad had been trained by the Jesuits, and he wanted me to read all these humanist, Aristotle books and stuff like that. And I just, man, it's like, thanks for the beer, Dad, right? And then I started thinking, well, even if I went to read that, how does that work for us as engineers? How do I go back as a CIO and say to my dev teams, hey, I've got this ethical framework for y'all. Let's talk about St. Thomas Aquinas and what he would do. And of course, that wouldn't go anywhere, right? So I was trying to come up with a very lightweight way to test it. So I did. So about 18 months ago, maybe now closing in on 2 years, I wrote out a framework and tried to implement it in just a basic Scrum methodology. And so I had 2 Scrum teams that were senior enough that they would tell me what they thought, right? They wouldn't say, oh, you're the CIO, I'm gonna kiss you, right? And I was also going to some of their meetings as sprint review because what they're doing was kind of important. So I said, hey, let's try this, just, at that point, suffer through what the boss is asking, but tell me what you really think. So I got a little bit of a presentation for you. So the way to think through this is, okay, let's imagine you're in a, and I hope everybody's understands Scrum and so forth, because it's kind of based around being able to do classic Agile development. So you got a couple week sprint going and you're doing a planning, it's whatever day. And I've got 2 use cases that are abstracted up just for an example, not necessarily in real cases. But so the one on the left is you've got to do some UX updates and some back-end work. So, classic kind of Scrum thing. And you're going to put in the unsubscribe button for something. And this is not the email. So the question is, you don't want to make the button to unsubscribe too big because you don't want people to unsubscribe too often, but you also don't want to make it so hard that they can't get it done, right? That would be an example of something that's not very ethical. Or, how many menus down should you bury it? And what if the best technical answers wrecks your UX standards? Well, hopefully your product manager can help you through that, or the team can suffer through it. But if it's a true ethical question, you'd say, well, maybe we should get the lawyers involved. And I don't know if you guys have worked with general counsels or something. They have no idea. They don't even know what Scrum means, right? So you say, come to a sprint planning, and they would stumble. Same thing if I was thinking on the data side. So you've got this was coming out of some work I was doing with another one of my teams on. We're trying to understand, we've got a big data set, complex thing, criteria. How do we come up with the pass rate to then forward in through an algorithm, right? And so the questions of the team, well, what's the pass criteria, right? Why pick 70, right? And what kind of population are we supposed to use? The classic questions you would have in a planning session, right? And as all of you guys are engineers, you get frustrated if no one can answer that. So these are the kind of the questions that are simple but illustrative of what happens in real life. So how do we solve that? Well, we could train our lawyers and ethicists to code. Good luck with that. We could all read Aristotle and you know, all that, and good luck with that too, right? I don't know if anybody here has got a philosophy background, but most of us don't. Or we could come up with something that's simple to use, and that's why I landed on number 3. So I then came up and said, okay, let's try and come up with these kind of code of context. So I said, okay, here are 9 questions we can ask, and they'll help guide you, right? This isn't gonna tell you a yes, no, right? So questions about illegality, right? Does it respect the dignity of all people, right? That's a really important one right now, given where we're at in the country. Is it sustainable, right? We heard from, you know, you guys want to do sustainable work. And I mean that not in a perpetual code working, but in a sustainability green fashion. Are we transparent and honest? You know, are we understanding who the people that can be harmed or are good, and so forth. And so you just go through these lists and you can kind of go down pretty simple questions. And my idea was you put this at the end of a sprint planning session. And so that's what we did. We said, okay, and our sprint planning for these 2 teams usually lasted 3 to 4 hours. And so right before we would break for lunch, we would chuck this up and see what happens. And so what we found is that most of the questions you just go right through and say, it doesn't count, right? We're just coding. We've got a basic problem. Get out of the way, right? But we did start to then hypothesize what would happen. And one of the things that came out is if you hit 2 of the questions make you pause, then you probably really do have an issue. And so that was just kind of an empirical learning based on 2 teams. And then the other one was, as we were working through it, we did discover that the Scrum Master has to kind of run this. I don't know how you guys run in your Scrum teams or if you have a good Scrum Master, but a good Scrum Master, as we all know, can really make a team hum. And if you're trying something a little bit new, that person's often very easy to get this going. And again, as you're trying it and trying to get yourself into an ethical framework, it's got to be practical, right? We can't have some sort of theory of humanistic society and so forth, and then not be able to translate that to something like, well, I got to have a 95% confidence ratio, right? That's the gap that we don't have, and that's the one I was trying to cross. And again, it's not very scientific in terms of probably answers, but this is where we are, and I don't think I've seen anybody come up with anything like this. So that's what I did, and as Dan said, I shared this at a Microsoft conference, and I've done it a couple of times. My last CIO job was based in Chicago. I've talked to a few other people who have done this, and I would be willing to bet that the people on this discussion, about half of you or some portion of you will think this is really interesting, and the rest are wishing they had a cold beer in front of you right now because it's super boring. And there's no gray area, right? People either really think this is interesting or they're completely uninspired. So just real quick, that was the kind of pitch in terms of how it works. And so I thought I'd throw it open to questions.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Have you, in kind of implementing this and kind of using it at work, have you found it catch a few things? What's sort of been some outcomes that you found?
We didn't catch anything because the stuff we're doing was fairly benign. And it wasn't a huge test. We only ran it for a few months. And then I actually had to, you know, like anything, if the boss isn't pushing on it, they dropped it quickly like a hot potato, right? So I for a couple of reasons, had to stop going to the sprint planning. And guess what? It didn't take any traction. Now, while I was there, people were quite good about following it and trying to answer questions and hypothesize. So you got to have someone who's got a passion for the subject.
Champion.
But the practical reality is most of the work we do day to day is not ethically gray, right? Or even, it doesn't lead to some sort of compromise position. But sometimes it does. And so how do you answer that?
Yeah, exactly. It brings up, I mean, it's kind of really important right now with big companies that are running into having their platforms give people platform dispute hate. So I think that you're enabling things now.
Right.
Some of us are.
And the other question, just thinking as a leader, is I've been a CIO 3 times, and 2 of them were in public companies, and you have to sign documents every year that say everything from I'm not ethically compromised to I didn't take out a loan to I don't have a yacht that the company owns, right? I mean, honestly, God, that's a question. And in the executive suite, most of the people want to try and do the right thing, but they also want to follow the rules. And they'll say, well, if the rule lets us, why don't we do it? Because we're in business. And so the conversations you hope do happen, but someone has to also push it and say, wait a minute, that's not where we want to be as a group. Again, and how do you, I kept coming back to, well, I'm an engineer, right? How do I know what to do? I don't want to have an ethics discussion with some philosophy guy.
Kevin, I'm super glad that you bring this conversation to us because software is eating the world, right? So up until maybe now, or maybe 10 years ago, I think it was fair for somebody in software to say, yeah, well, if I screw up, nobody dies.
Mm-hmm.
But that's officially false now.
Mm-hmm.
Like lives are on the line with the stuff we write, and even in innocuous ways. So I think it's pretty serious that we take a question like this seriously. And we may still be, there's enough corners of the software business where lives aren't on the line that we could probably get away with assuming that we can just skate past this and just do what we're told. But I think the days are numbered on that. I'm just thinking, all of the other professions that call themselves engineers have to go through licensure in order to make that claim, and it includes liability for failure of the engineered things. Now, I think it's pretty hard to figure out how to even play that game in software because it changes so fast compared to the other things that get engineered in the world. But businesses run on our stuff and crash and burn on our stuff, right? So there's at least serious financial consequences, and medical systems, the ways in which now telemedicine is running over Zoom and Slack. Zoom and Slack were written for HIPAA compliance, right?
Right.
Anyway, yeah.
But I think you have to distinguish between security posture, which we can always be better at, right, and the ethical ones. So go back to that Volkswagen case, right? So the early code for them to do smog testing, they hard coded some results and then worked backwards into their code as they're doing unit and system test, right? And then didn't change the hard code at the end. That was part of the problem. And so that hard code, you might say, well, I didn't hurt anybody, but darn it, how come they didn't speak up? When we say, oops, guys, hey, wait a minute, it's always going to give you this result because we forgot to change the values. In the end, no one was hurt. There's more pollution, so you can argue that it's a collective fault. But it's a perfect example of where someone should have raised their hand and said, wait a minute. Right, and maybe not even have done that to do the hard code, right? That might have even been a better question. Why'd you hard code the result? Right. So it can happen to everybody.
Do you think that any of the trends common in our work right now related to microservices and people kind of maybe being just a bit more segmented into different parts of a system versus working in the whole of it makes it harder to kind of keep a mindset related to the ethics of the whole thing. I don't know if that, maybe that's not even related to whether you have a single bigger software project versus many small ones, but I don't know. I'm just curious if that sounds true or false or.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. So if you're spending all your time on isolated code that's Microsoft, just a microservice, versus if you're in the enterprise architecture group, then your view of the solution is different. But on the other hand, I would say, again, speaking as an executive, gosh, I would hope people are understanding the picture beyond just their API calls, right? And where that's going. Yeah, Dan's laughing, right?
I wouldn't count on it, right?
I know
you hope, but
yeah. But it's a fair question, Ryan. I think I don't know the answer, but it's something that we all have to watch out for, right? At some point, you can't say I was too junior. On the other hand, most people don't see the whole picture. So,
I just want to say I love I've already told you why I love this framework, but to me, like systematization is key to software quality, right? And so these 9 questions you can pop in, and they just become part of the system. And like Kevin said, like 90% of the time, they might not touch anything, but like even just if I was an executive at a company and I put these in, that is a very profound statement, right? If you're VP of engineering, you say, hey, everyone, I want you to do this. That's just a big statement, like, hey, I really care about ethics. And you can always point back to Volkswagen or other situations. But building systems is what we're really good at. And this is just a way to incorporate something that's squishy into a system.
And it helps push the culture, right? Get people to think and speak up, right? Again, to Ryan's question, hey, I don't know what's going to happen here. Can someone help me? That's a really good question.
I really like that Volkswagen example. I think another big one might be the Boeing example, in which you have your systems engineers that are pretty low level and they know that something's wrong, but you've got higher up saying that this is your job and this is your bottom line, which I think is a really sort of interesting stance to take. And if you are one of those lower level people, how do you even communicate to your boss or your supervisor or even above them that these things are wrong?
Right. And, organizations are different. So Boeing, I know some of the Boeing senior people from they're headquartered in Chicago when I used to live there. And personally, I was surprised to hear that was the culture that you saw, right? Because they did not display that on a personal level. So something was wrong there. Probably still is, right? I heard Boeing's still got problems. But as a programmer, what's your option, right? Well, you have to speak up at some point. You have to tell somebody, and then at some point, if it gets really bad, you're either going to, if it's really illegal, you have to do something even more drastic, right? So, but if it's just kind of sketchy and kind of gray, you're like, well, maybe this sounds terrible. Maybe you shouldn't work there, right? But
I'm also curious. Oh,
go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, the other thing about the Boeing thing for me is that, I can see everything that happened, in my head. I can imagine the path to go from, oh, well, we want to make a faster jet, but we don't want to actually re-engineer the jet, so we're going to do all this software stuff. I can see that path in my head of, how you get there.
Mm-hmm.
And, to me, when I heard about what happened with the Max, I was like, oh, I can see how that would happen. Not to defend it, but there's a part of it too where it's you have to ask, is software the right spot for this solution? Or maybe to not have hubris about software's potentials, or I don't know, that was kind of.
Right, the concept of the max is, well, let's use software to engineer better. It's reasonable, right? And, you know, we're all engineers. Who wouldn't want that challenge? It's the execution, right?
Well, and they've been playing that game inside the cockpit for decades, right? We've got all kinds of software running our planes right now. So why not use it to try to optimize the actual engines, or to accommodate putting an engine in a spot that it doesn't belong on a wing?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm with you, Elise. It's a completely rational line of thought that can take you there and still end up killing people. So this is, and yeah, this is why we got to take it seriously.
Wasn't that more about optimizing the pilots, not actually the plane? I mean, wasn't the long-term perspective to eliminate pilots and therefore justify the increased cost of the planes by downsizing the labor? Because there'd be less pilots.
They were using software to account for the fact that they were basically putting the engine in a completely like in a pretty problematic spot, but they thought they could solve the piloting problem by having the software like help out. It was.
Yeah, I can get specific about it. They put.
Hey guys, we're gonna have to put a pin in it because Brad only has about 30 minutes for us.
Okay, cool.
And
I was enjoying that. I want to hear the punchline.
Yeah.
So quick, I think I can do this quickly. The engines that they put on the Max were too big to fit under the wing for the height of the landing gear. And so they mounted the engine forward on the wing, which changed the center of gravity of the aircraft because of the size of the engine. And then tries to use software to change how the controls would work to be able to accommodate the fact that the center of gravity was further forward on the plane than it was originally intended to be. So it had to do with size of engine and length of landing gear. And if they had changed those things, it would have engaged FAA regulations about retraining pilots. And so the cost of the FAA thing and the retraining their entire crew across the entire industry would have made it impossible for them to sell the plane, because retraining the pilots is not okay. So it's a combination of failures that includes executive decisions saying, yeah, I guess we'll try and let this go, or talking ourselves collectively into the idea that the software is going to make it work okay. And it didn't, clearly.
So just to kind of sum up, I'm not sure my light ethical framework would have caught all that.
Yeah.
Because there's multiple failures. So I don't want to oversell the idea we just talked about.
Cool.
You know, at some point there is some bad decisions.